All right, it is time for us to get started. And we just happen to have a lot of ground to cover today. Quite a bit of ground to cover today. We're in Genesis 11 starting out. And I think of all the lessons, this is probably the most packed one so far. It's 4 chapters and quite a bit. Let's get started with a prayer, though, and then we'll dive into our lesson. Jonathan, would you lead us in a prayer?
Our God and our Father, we humbly come before you this morning, and Father, we praise you and we thank you, Father, for hearing our prayers, for allowing us to come before you and welcoming us as your children and your people. As we study this morning from your word and the history of your relationship with your people, we look at what you expect from us and the covenants and how you fulfill your promises. Father, we just help us to remember that nothing's changed, that you still love us and you still keep your promises to us and you will care for us and fulfill everything you've said. Please watch over us and guide us as we study. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right, and thank Jason for sitting in and teaching with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we'll get just straight into we hope a Slido. This is where I go, hey, Christian, nothing's working now. Christian, if you could go check that PowerPoint, it's stuck. I don't know what happened. So we'll just get into, this first Slido question was pretty simple. What's the sin here in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel? What is the sin with the Tower of Babel? And that's an interesting question because as a kid growing up, I don't know that I fully understood this story till I got older. We've really broken things this morning,
Yeah,
Jason. What is the sin in the Tower of Babel? Not filling the earth. Okay. Not filling the earth. Being disobedient. Okay. Anybody else? What's that? Okay. I think it's a Slido interaction that messed up, so leave it like that. We're good. Yeah, I think there's a lot going on here. Let me first say that when I was growing up, this is what I thought the Tower of Babel looked like. Maybe you did too, but that's what my mind was. Leaning Tower of Pisa, maybe a good way to look at it, but not leaning. And why would we think that? These, by the way, are kind of interpretations of the Tower of Babel. Why would we think that?
Of reaching into the heavens is kind
Okay.
of it gives you that.
The reaching the heavens. And as a child, I thought that the purpose of these buildings was for what? What did you? Maybe nobody else thought this. Maybe I was an outlier, but I thought it was for man to go up to the heavens. Probably not entirely accurate because we have these things called ziggurats that we have in other cultures. First off, you may not think that's very impressive compared to the picture before there. But for that time period, that's pretty impressive too. And the ziggurats in ancient culture were methods. Well, here's the best way I can describe it. It's an elevator for the gods. And so it's the opposite, I think, of what I thought as a kid, in other words. It's a way for God to come down to man in ancient culture. Now, that's important because I think when we think about that and we consider that, that also has a role to play, I think, in understanding all of this going on. And everything that was said, I think, is right. But the people want to make a name for themselves and stay in this one place that would be so great that also it would entice God to come to them in that sense. And it has a lot to do with, well, and this is one of your questions, I think, was how is this similar in some ways to what happens in Genesis chapter 3? That was one of the questions. What's that? Want to be like God? And how's God's response? At the end of Genesis 3, what does God say? Well, at the end, after the curses, he says about man what?
He would become like God.
Okay, something else. Turn over there because it's really interesting in Genesis chapter 3. I think this is one of the more interesting things. He's become like one of us, so he's become like God. But look at this next phrase in verse 22. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. And it's almost as if God is saying what here? We've got to stop man. We have to stop man from achieving what he's setting out to achieve. And in some ways, that's what's going on here too. We got to put an end to this. We've got to stop man's pursuit of becoming more like God. And involved in this is heavily the idea of pride. You've got that in Genesis chapter 3, and you've got that here in Genesis chapter 11. Let's make a name for ourselves. So I think there's a lot, all this to say, I think there's a lot more going on here than just a simple disobedience per se. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that, Jason?
No, I mean, that was spot on with what I was thinking. You know, like you said, the pride behind it, making a name for themselves, and then, and then ultimately they both get scattered out of the garden, and they both get scattered out of Babel.
Correct, absolutely. God disperses them in both cases. I want to make, before we move on, a New Testament tie into this. What's the New Testament equivalent of the Tower of Babel?
Church of Jerusalem, perhaps.
Use your microphone. That's why we give it to you.
Jerusalem, perhaps?
In what way? In what way?
Not that there was pride involved. It's just God had a purpose, and he wanted his people to go forth and reflect the glory of his Son in the whole earth. So when he gives the commandment in Matthew 28:20, that's to disciples, but that I'm sure the message has passed along. This is what the Lord said. As much time as they were spending together, and so they knew that the ultimate plan of God was to spread the gospel over the whole earth, but they weren't doing that. And it wasn't an evil thing. It's just God said, okay, this is how I'm going to accomplish this.
Yeah, for them it's more of a comfort thing. It's more of a stay together, and that's the difference. But in Genesis 11, there's this, in Genesis 10 actually, there's this command to be fruitful and multiply, to go out and to fill the earth. And they're not doing that. And so in Genesis 11, God sends strange language and forces them to scatter. And here in Acts, if we go to Acts, about Acts 8, what does he send instead of language? It's persecution. And so persecution forces them to spiritually procreate. And so that's the New Testament parallel to all of that. So the question that becomes, why? This is the question at the end of every section is, why do these Israelites in the wilderness need to hear this story? And there could be a couple of different answers here probably, not just one. But what are some reasons they need to hear this story?
They had been given similar instructions to go in and fill a land, right?
Okay.
Not to bunch up in one city, but to conquer, fulfill all the instructions of God. But beyond that, we haven't seen it as much yet, but we will later. Their pride was a weakness too for them, just like we've seen so far.
Okay. Got anything else?
They're constantly wanting to go back to Egypt. Or mentioning that,
Yeah.
This is another something that they could hear and say, you know what? No, you don't need to go back.
Yeah. How well do they do, by the way, at spreading out and filling the land that's given to them? Anybody know?
They do a poor job of it. They don't do
Yeah.
they don't do everything God tells them to do as far as taking over folks, destroying all the nations around them, and then then they mess it up. The kingdom splits. I mean, they end up poor.
Yeah, they do a pretty bad job, and I don't know that we normally put that together, because when Joshua dies, one of the things that's pointed out is not all the land's been conquered. Now you see like Caleb go and conquer his land, right? It's interesting that you see Caleb go do the job, but then you see other parts of the land. Many of the parts of the land aren't conquered till well after the reign of David. Really is when the majority of the land. That's one of the reasons that David is recognized as such a great king. He went and did the job that should have been done by the generation Joshua leaves behind. And they, for lack of a better explanation, really they just get comfortable. Hey, we've got enough. We don't need all this. And we don't want to keep going to war. And as a result of that, they just don't do it. The other thing I would say about this is, what's explained by this story? Maybe that's a good way to also ask. What's explained by this? And by the way, the title of the lesson may help with this. Jason, have any thoughts? I thought it was an easier question. Because in Tower of Babel, what do they want to be? They want to be one city. Mm-hmm. Not even a nation. They're wanting to be one city. And the Tower of Babel is why you have all these nations. This is the origin story of all the different people. It's also the origin story of these people and them, how they were all descendants of Noah, but God splits them up. And then one of the things you get explained by that is how quickly everybody goes to their own gods. It all starts here in Genesis 11. And I think that's pretty interesting as well. Any other thoughts, questions? Anybody to add to that? Anything about the Tower of Babel? It's also where we get the languages from. Okay. We're either asleep or we exhausted that. So we could, if you would like, just read through the genealogy of Noah here together, but I will abstain from that. Yeah, everybody's already asleep. And why do we have genealogies? Know where we came from? Okay. Anybody do that? Genealogy stuff? My father-in-law did that family tree stuff online, and dinner would often be about how he found this one person who had 3 wives and 47 different kids, because of the internet. And I would be like, not all things online are true, but he never bought into that. So we had a lot of those conversations, and he had people all the way back to like the 900s, supposedly. And I got to tell you, that doesn't interest me at all. That bores me, quite frankly.
I think, and I don't know if it's as important for us as Americans as it is for some other peoples. I don't know why that is. I mean, if you think about it, all the people here in America are immigrants or some type of people that came here not that long ago, right?
Kind of mutts.
Right, we are, and we're just rebellious people. Who are we? That's who we are. But I don't know. I had a cousin that did that and did the genealogy stuff. And, I think he went into it wanting to see if, where our allegiances lie in the Civil War, and we had people on both sides, and it's like. It was interesting. I mean, it's interesting to go all the way back to England and, cousins in royalty, but, I mean, it's pretty disassociated.
Do you have royal blood in you?
No. I
Okay.
mean, it's like like the Duke of something and the Earl of whatever, I don't
Duke of
know.
Rawls.
Yeah. It's probably the Duke of Sandwich,
My favorite part of this y'all don't know is Lauren's tapping him to say, please stop that.
You had to know your genealogy.
Attention to the children.
I mean, and it's funny for us, like, you're a Texan.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when you talk to Jason, I don't know if y'all know that, but he'll tell you he's from Texas. Right?
So far, yeah.
Yeah. You're becoming an Alabama.
As the years go on, yeah.
Yeah, but he roots for Texas teams, and he's a Texas guy, right? I'm a Tennessee guy. Like, I live in foreign territory down here. I think it's interesting for us. We attribute ourselves even more to our states than, like, I'm from France or England or some other place. So it's just kind of interesting. But why in the Bible is genealogy important? Why is it so important there?
It's real important for if you had to know your genealogy if you were from Israel.
You didn't want to be especially a Levite out of place doing the wrong thing, but you had to know in order to be a true Israelite where you came from, and this would end up being important because of all the because of where Jesus comes from.
Okay, that's because you're going to know knowing what tribe you're from is like knowing which state you're from. You're going to know that. Mm-hmm. But the genealogies in all these chapters are really important because they're tracing the lineage of man to the Messiah. So when you go read Matthew 1 or Luke 3, these genealogies should show up, and you should be able to match up genealogies and be able to see and go back and connect Jesus to the history of the Bible. And so we read all this begat stuff. Let's be honest, we don't read it for the most part, right? What do you do when you get to that?
Yeah, traditionally I just kind of go through it and just kind of skim through it. But, this time I actually kind of wrote down and went down the list, and I was like, it was a lot more fascinating this time than maybe in prior times I've read it.
And why is that? Just because you had to teach, or?
Well, not only that, but but it's neat to see the promises that are given and how they're fulfilled through the lineage. And so it's as the reader, it's kind of fun to follow that and kind of see how it plays out.
Yeah. I tell a story that I've got a collection of the Bible. It's like in 5 volumes. There's no chapters and verses in it. It just reads like a normal book. And one day I was reading through Genesis, and I got through the end of chapter 11, which means I had read a couple of genealogies without skipping them like I normally do, because I got tricked into it, because the verses weren't there to let me know to skip, right? And the headings. And you do learn stuff if you take the time to read through it. You learn things you wouldn't know otherwise. I like in this book how we have an emphasis a little bit on, we have the emphasis on who are the descendants of Shem. Who are the descendants of Shem? Abraham. Yeah, we get to Abraham. And so that's where we get to this idea of the people of Israel coming from Shem. Right, that's where the word Semite or Semitism, that's where the root word for that. If you hear anti-Semitism, that's where that comes from. It's from the lineage of Shem. But we also learned something in here that's really important, which is what about Sarai? What do we learn about her? She's barren. Why is that so important? Chris?
Ultimately, that our lineage is a lineage by faith. It's how the whole lineage came about, that Christ would come, which is by faith. And so we can trace our lineage back in a sense that is in the same manner
Okay.
that it came to her.
Okay. Why is her barrenness important? Joe, you grabbed your mic, which means you're ready to talk.
It seems like to me that would be a lesson for the a lesson for us, but a lesson for the Israelites. Most applicable to this lesson is that without God, there is no Israel. So there is no Israel, the son. And so God's intervention, and it teaches them about the nature of faith. Faith is believing in the impossible, because we're capable of the possible. God's capable of the impossible. And we should always have that barrier in our minds that we are not God, nor will we ever get close to that. His abilities, His knowledge, His wisdom, everything that goes with being God, and we're just not. So it points out our dependence, that without him, we're no nation. We don't even exist.
Okay.
So,
All right, Chris, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was gonna say basically what Joe said, it's just that picture of barrenness and being cast out of the garden into a wasteland, barren wasteland. It's only by God that garden is seen as going to return.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Lauren? Yeah, turn it on. Dad, help us out. There you go.
Okay. This is just kind of interesting because we were talking about this in my biblical foundation class, and we were talking about how the issue of Sarah's barrenness is that she's also included in God's promise, like with Abraham. And when Abraham had Ishmael, that took Sarah out of the promise. So having her barrenness would end the genealogy, basically, and that wouldn't. That's the issue with it.
Yeah, and we're not to Ishmael yet, but I did think when Joe was talking about we can do the possible, that's what they try to do. They step in and do the possible, and that's where also faith comes into play. Like Chris was talking about, is like, how much faith does it take when you're 100 years old and barren to believe these promises? Like, that's a huge issue, wouldn't you think? I mean,
Oh, for sure, and it just kind of shows that it doesn't really matter the obstacle through the lineage. The promise is going to be fulfilled.
right. And that's hard for us. Do we struggle sometimes with the promises of God?
Yeah, I think what Joe said is the most critical piece. Without God, we are nothing. And without God, the Israelites would have been just everyone else. They would have been nothing to God. They're just normal. And without God, we're normal, which means we're condemned.
Yeah.
We're lost. We're utterly without hope. But with God, we have the possibility of everything. And you know, the promises of God throughout his book, you know, of living with him again one day, you know, going back to the garden, it's really astounding. And without God's amazing power to make something from nothing, we have no hope.
Yeah. And we've talked about this some, I think, recently, but the idea of being barren is there's a sense of hopelessness with that. That is true today, by the way. Parents will often go to really extensive measures to have children that struggle with fertility, and understandably so. They're a blessing. But in this time, it was even a bigger deal. Hannah, when you think about Hannah pouring out her heart and wanting a child so bad, just to give birth to a son, she would then dedicate him to the Lord. Or you think about Rachel and Leah, how that God actually uses the blessing of Leah's womb to gain favor in her husband's eyes. And that just, the value that comes from that is something that's really important to kind of consider. And so there's also this restoration, this giving or fulfilling this promise of hope. That she is part of the promises. She's part of the lineage. And that's important to see. Now, why is this important to the wilderness Israelites? They're getting ready to go into the land. Why does this matter? This idea that Sarah was barren, or any of these genealogies. We talked a little bit about the genealogies, about knowing where you come from, but let's talk about just specifically with Sarah. What's the application for them?
They're created as part of a miracle. It's part of something that could not happen, but God can make anything happen.
Okay, so their existence is what we call miraculous, because he opened her womb, and not just opened it, but in an age where it shouldn't work. Let's be for real. It shouldn't function in that way.
Well, how can a nation that was just a bunch of slaves that had nothing be anything?
Right?
You know, so, you know, from that standpoint, I think.
But if
Well-
God can reverse the barrenness of Sarah, and we just add this to the list of things so far, or defeat the giants with the flood, or any of these things, then he's going to follow through with these promises. And what they're getting ready to do, we're about to get to chapter 12. We're going to have to go pretty quickly because we're taking too much time, honestly, probably. But we get to chapter 12, there's these 3 promises. What are the 3 promises? Land, nation, seed. And what are we getting ready to have? Land. And the other thing is this connects them to the fulfillment of the promises, just like God reversing the barrenness of Sarah.
Their everyday existence is going to be predicated on God's miraculous gifts. I mean, if they don't have the food, they're going to starve to death. You know,
Yeah.
every day they should look to these miraculous promises being fulfilled and remember. I mean, that's a lot of what the Old Testament is remembrance of God and His provision for us.
Okay? Joe?
It also helps us understand the depth of the sin of the 10 spies, because what they do is they say, God, we don't believe your story. We don't believe that, essentially,
It's kind of
we
an
don't believe
Ishmael
your
moment,
promise.
isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
God,
It's like,
yeah.
but even deeper. Well, maybe not deeper than Ishmael, but it's just a depth of sin that just says, God, I don't believe you, and there's just zero faith.
A lack of trust, and I've got to handle this on my own. Absolutely. All right, the promises. Why are these promises so important? And by the way, in kids' Bible drill class or in their classes, if they're going over Bible facts, these are part of those Bible facts. I mean, that's how foundational what happens in Genesis chapter 12 is. You know, we want kids to be able to say land, nation, seed. We want to be able to go. Why is that important? Why does that matter? Eric says, would we be sitting here teaching without these promises? No. No, that's a good point. Yeah.
Probably for faith. I mean, you can't see any of this.
Yeah.
You know, so we have to have faith in something.
Okay.
And they needed something, I guess, you know, believable, physical that they could lay their hands on.
Right. What is the focal point of the promises? Huh?
God can make anything happen, and that Jesus, ultimately, it's Jesus.
Yeah. Ultimately, this is really about Jesus. It's not about Israel. I think that's hard sometimes to figure out. Because Israel is really just the vehicle to bring about the Messiah. That's really important and so what we see here is this is this nation that's going to be formed, and the nation's going to bless the earth, but not through their nationhood, but through this one descendant that will come and will be a sacrifice. It's the messianic, and that's where the lineage and all these things are pointing to Jesus, right? And that's important. Jason, on the trip to Egypt, what did you find out about that, by the way? This Abraham's or Abram's. Abrams, I guess, easier to write. Abraham rolls off the tongue for some reason. But what about Egypt versus Israel here? What did you find there?
Well, it was reading back through this that some of it, I may have not connected in the past, and I thought, after looking through it a little bit more, it was kind of fascinating that, like, Abram, in a way, he was in captivity with Pharaoh, and ultimately there was a plague and then blessings to send him off going forward. And the same thing you see with the Israelites. And it's, they had their own form of captivity. They were freed from slavery. But then they also had doubt. They were scared. They didn't ultimately maybe listen to the promises that were given. And because of that, there were consequences.
Yeah. I mean, Abram lies about his wife, right? And as a result of that, she's taken captive. And in that process of this story, there's a lack of faith on Abraham's part for God to trust him.
And it's a famine that takes him
Yeah, it's a famine just like with Jacob that takes him to Egypt. He goes to Egypt for help, held captive, plagues what delivers him, like Jason said, and then they're released. And so, now, why is that story powerful to these people? This should be pretty simple. Okay, he overcomes. What else?
It's their story.
Yeah, it's kind of this, it's to me in some ways it's kind of like the giants. We looked at the Nephilim and comparing it going backwards, right, from Numbers 14 to Genesis 6. God's already done this once, he can do it again. And so this idea here is you're only here, you're here because God's already done this. That's why you exist now. So he's going to do it again with you. And then we have here the story of Abram and Lot. So, and listen, we're not going to talk all about the Sodom and Gomorrah stuff yet, but we're going to introduce it today. But what happens between Abram and Lot? What goes on there? They had too much stuff? Okay. What kind of stuff specifically? Livestock, yeah. What's the problem with too much livestock, Jason? I mean, you're getting that rancher experience these days.
Enough to know that if you have too many in one area, it's not good.
Yeah. Tell me this. I know you don't talk evil of the family, but do they share pastures? They got their own cows, right?
I think it's good for everyone that you can kind of disperse and.
Yeah. Right? Because there's so much livestock that it's harming. There's not enough land to sustain the herds. And what's that created? Tension where?
The herders.
Between the herdsmen, right? The guys out there with the livestock, they're fighting, trying to take care of their herds because one of the things is they're going to be held responsible for how well their herd does, right? So you've got Abram and Lot, and we know that Abram has over 300 servants. We're going to find that out here in a little bit, right? At least 300. And Lot has his own set of things, and there's other people in the area too. We know that too. The story mentions they're not the only ones there. So then Abram comes to Lot. One of the things I want to point out about Abram, you find out, is not only is we're going to see him as a warrior here in a minute, but he's really a peacemaker too at times. Have you ever seen that? Where he's here, okay, this is not good. Let's find a peaceful way to resolve this. Later on, with the situation with Lot and God, he tries to negotiate peace for Lot with God, right? And so you have all that going on. So where does Lot go? How does Lot choose his land?
Well, it looks good, man. The Jordan Valley is well watered, everything's great.
Okay, the Jordan Valley. By the way, the entire Jordan Valley is below sea level. So what that means is what? Water goes down, right? Water rolls downhill. And so that's what's going on. That's the good area. And what does he compare it to? What does he compare this area to? Do you remember?
Was it the garden?
Yeah, he does. Yeah. He compares it to the garden and to Egypt. I don't know if you thought about this, but I read this and I thought, well, how does Lot know what the garden looked like? Yeah. How does Lot know what do you think that's really about?
Oral history. I think that's what it is.
Yeah. I think that's about Moses saying, this place is that good. It's more about Moses. And now, very likely Lot did know what Egypt looked like. So it's probably one of these deals where Lot probably saw it like Egypt, but Moses may be extending it in the storytelling to say it was like the garden. But what else is in this area? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And there's a lack of wisdom here a little bit, don't you think?
Oh, for sure.
Why is that?
I mean, the sin that they have in there, I mean, I don't know if you were looking for a better answer than that.
No, but I think you're exactly right. It's a simple answer. He saw the green grass and he didn't think about the impact on him or his family.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all that mattered to him. And, you know, we sometimes twist this story into respecting your elders. I don't think that's really what's going on here. This is an illustration about really more so of how you make choices. And Abraham goes up, and what does God tell Abraham in all of this? Essentially, don't fear.
Everything else you see right here is yours.
Yeah. But he also tells him, you're going to be fine. You're not getting the better land, but you're going to be fine. I'll take care of you. And I think that's really important. So, this comparison to Eden and Egypt, is that a blessing or a warning? Yes. Why a warning?
Because it looks good. That should be your focus.
Okay.
Focus should be on God. Your focus should be humility, ultimately. I think there's lack of wisdom, like you said, but, I think it really shows the heart, right, of the person.
They're going into a land that's full of evil people
Okay.
and evil nations. You know, they're just like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah. And so this land that they're going into contains this Jordan Valley, right? And so they're going in there, the same evil is going to be there. Eden and Egypt were great lands, but they both had the possibility to do evil. And what ends up happening in both cases is the people that leave those places or go to those places and come out, they end up choosing evil. And there's a warning here, hey, this is a great land, but you better be aware that just because it's a great land doesn't mean there's not evil there. And that's an important thing there. Anything to add to that section there, Jason?
You know, you gave me kind of like spark notes
Yeah,
for
I
this
did.
assignment with the leaders manual, and I never would have put it together otherwise. When in there it was talking about how, you know, when they were casted out of the garden, they went east.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Lot choosing to the east, and both of them are kind of doomed to go in that direction.
Yeah. And not that going east is always bad, but in those stories, going east was not good.
No.
It was not good. Atlanta's east from here. Oh, yeah. Here you go.
Preach.
There is not a big chunk of Tennessee that's east. It's north. Y'all don't even know your directions in Alabama. So yeah, that east thing was interesting, and I had never put that together as well. We've got a few minutes. Let's try to wrap this up. What happens to Lot in this great land? He becomes a POW. He is. It sounds like a big war, doesn't it? There's a bunch of kings that come up against a bunch of kings, and one bunch of kings wins, and Lot's on the losing side, and he's taken as plunder, essentially. And so it's interesting here to think about that then, how's Lot rescued? Yeah. How many people go with Abram?
300 something.
Like 318, I think, something like that.
Yep.
So here's these armies of thousands that battle it out and they fight. Here goes, it's kind of, I get Gideon kind of flashbacks a little bit. Here goes Abraham with his 318 herdsmen. And what do?
Yeah, they're victorious.
Yeah. And they do defeat him.
It talks a lot about there being 5 kings. So
Right.
Not just, so there's a lot of emphasis added on, this is a great feat.
Yeah, this is...
Again, this is without God, they don't win.
Yeah, without God, there's no way they win this. This is the providence of God.
One of the things that I've been looking at is, they didn't just defeat them right there. They chased them down.
Oh, yeah, they didn't give up. Yeah. This is a whooping. Yeah. And what did they get? Everything. They recover essentially everything. And what does Abram do with that stuff? Okay, he gives a tenth to Melchizedek. He comes. Where's Melchizedek from? What will become Jerusalem? It's called Salem here, right? And Melchizedek's important. This is one of those things that we don't understand until Hebrews, really. But here is a priest king who serves Jehovah, comes out, shows hospitality to Abram on their way after this battle. And Abram, he blesses Abram, and then Abram in turn blesses him by giving him essentially a tithing, a tenth of everything that he has. And then he liberates Lot. But what does he do with all the stuff?
He doesn't keep it. Keep the spoils and stuff. He doesn't keep it.
Why not?
You don't want to be beholden to the king, Solomon.
Yeah. The only thing he takes, I did think it was interesting, he does take payment for the food he provided for everybody.
Yes.
He does give him a hospitality bill. Yeah. Yeah, he gives him a dining bill, which is pretty interesting. Why is that important, by the way? Why is this story important? That's my last question here. Why does this story need to be told to these people wandering, getting ready to go across the Jordan?
God is the genesis of their freedom. Without God, this victory doesn't happen.
Okay. All right, Scott?
Yeah, it's all about God. It's all about showing the promise is going to be fulfilled. It's all about the fact that, while they look small in the eyes of people that they're about to go to feet or about to go, into the land of Canaan and all that kind of gives them the understanding that God has done this over and over again.
Right? Yeah. What do you think about that? Same thing? Or?
Pretty much the same thing. I also was thinking about how the spies, they went and observed the land and, talked about these great armies that they couldn't overcome. And, I'm sure they're all aware of these stories of Abram, and it's been passed down, and they know all about it. So it's kind of fascinating, the lack of faith and, the disobedience that they have, even though they know these things.
I don't know if they know this or not. Of course, we know it from Hebrews, but that there's somebody out there greater than Abram.
Sure. I'm not sure they know that. And that's the application for us. There's somebody greater than Melchizedek. There's somebody greater than Abram. There's somebody greater than, you can fill that blank in with a lot. So we know that, but if we're just looking from their perspective, I think part of this is, God gives overwhelming victory. This is one of those stories, right? It's like, you think about, as Jason says, you think about these people that go in and spy out the land, and they look at the land, and it's great, but then they see these Nephilim, and they're saying, well, we're just grasshoppers in their eyes. And here's this story of Abram with basically 300 ranch hands defeating the armies of these 5 kings by themselves. And it's a story that says, hey, look, God is the God that wins against overwhelming odds all the time. That's what this story's about. And why did God do that for Abram? To keep his promises. Right? I think one of the things that's interesting, and think of it this way, this is one of the things I'd not maybe thought of, is Abram's going to rescue his family. God has to protect Abram in this fight. Why? Because he's made the promise and there's no heir yet. There's no son. So he's got to keep him alive. And I'm not sure Abram there is testing God. Don't take it that way. It's just God's going to make these promises happen. And I think that's part of the lesson here is God's going to keep these promises despite the odds. That includes taking this land. And your parents didn't get that. And that's why they wandered around till they died. But you're going to go across the Jordan, and I'm going to give you the land, and you're going to take cities. I mean, they're going to also fight against a group of Amorite kings. And that's a great story. So you're going to have all these things, and if this is setting them up to have that, like you said, this kind of faith their parents didn't have, that they failed to have.
And it's the same lesson to us today.
Yeah. we're out of time, guys. Thank you, Jason.